became its own thing. Cool. So Hope Not Hate, just broadly, very quickly before I get into myself. I mean, we look at, we do various things. I'm the head of research. So my job is I head a team of researchers based in the UK, and our job is to monitor far-right threats, both in the UK, but also internationally. So we look at domestic far-right threats ranging from far-right terrorist groups through to kind of radical right populist parties. So things like, a UKIP would be probably as far mainstream as we would go. But we also look at mainstream kind of issues when there's mainstream issues in parties, for example, like anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, or we've also talked up about Islamophobia within the Conservative Party. But my team's primary job is essentially monitoring and attempting to disrupt the far right. And we do that through both infiltration work, which I guess we'll talk a little bit about tonight. We do it through kind of open source research. We do it, and we also do it through campaigning. So we campaign during elections and those sorts of things. Me personally, I grew up in Woking, the Las Vegas of Surrey, I think as it's sometimes called. I grew up there. I live in London now. I live in North London. And I joined Hope Not Hate 10 years ago, actually. I joined as I'd just come out of university. I was a failed musician. And so I started campaigning, kind of volunteering for Hope Not Hate. And at the time, you might remember the 2010 general election was a really big deal in terms of the far right. The British National Party were very, very strong at the time. And of course, they were the most electorally successful far right party ever in Britain, much more than Mosley. And there was a big battle for the council in Dagenham where it looked like they might take control. And I went out and volunteered there for 6 to 9 months. And then kind of never left properly, really. Hope Not Hate, we kind of talk about it like it's a bit like Hotel California. I've tried to leave about 3 times and I always end up coming back. And I went away and studied again, and I went and did a PhD on British fascism, and then came back on the research team now. Don't know what else to say really, other than, as was mentioned, I'm unfortunately an Everton fan.
When you went to high school, and this question will be pertinent later on, did you ever do amateur dramatics?
Funny enough, I did. What a strange question. But I did briefly, yeah. Our school would do kind of a yearly play, and I used to be in those, and then I actually moved over to be in the band for them instead. But I'm intrigued to see how you bring that one around.
Well, actually, to me, it's straight obvious. I'm astonished you don't spot it straight away. You had to spend your time when you were living with some of these characters lying through your back teeth. And to do that successfully, you had to have been, in some way, a decent actor.
Yeah, no, actually, I talk a bit about that in the book, actually, about how, in hindsight, when I wrote the book and looked back a little bit, I kind of got slightly worried about how good at lying I perhaps got. But I mean, it was all for, I would like to think, a good reason. So
we are going to talk about the book called Drums in the Distance, Journeys into the Global Far Right, which Joe has just released. Amongst the things I'm going to try and remember to ask you, Joe, is why it's been published now, given the potential risk to your own life of people knowing who you are and what you are. If people read your book, and of course you hope they do, and I hope they do as well, I think one of the things that came to me in a very distressing way, it's not an easy book to read, is that you call it Drums in the Distance, but when you read the book, it's blooming near. It is not in the distance. It's neither in the geographic distance or a distance in time. Some of the threats that you talk about in this book, and just, I was with a couple for lunch earlier on this week who were living in Tehran when the Shah was falling. Mm-hmm. And I remember my parents phoning them because they were watching all the riots going out on the street and a protest for Khomeini, and phoning them saying, "Get home, it is not safe." And they said, "It's fine, I don't know what you're talking about, there's no problems." They had no idea. And it kind of a little bit reminded me that of my own grandmother, who left it to the very last minute. Even though my dad had left, even though her daughter had left, even though my grandfather had left, my grandmother got on the boat the 29th of August to get the hell out of Germany. And on the one hand, sometimes, reading the book, you think Joe's being alarmist. And then you think, you know what? It is way closer than we think. But before we do that, we are going to go into the academic stuff a bit. And it does seem dry, but it turns out to be extremely important. Reading the book, I'm reading about fascists, far right, ultra right, alt-right, right light, light right. I've got no idea. And Joe, just give us a bit of a clue, because people read this stuff in the press about a fascist or far right or alt-right. And sometimes I think, you know what, they're getting away with it. They're just bloody nasty bits of work. And let's just deal with, why can't we just call them nasty bits of work? Because it has significance for politics. Can you just go through your description of fascist, far right, alt-right, ultra-right, and alt-right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I should say, I mean, the publisher was a bit like, do we really need this? And I said, I do think there's a useful thing for it. And I think there's a practical reason that definitions, I mean, I won't kind of bore everyone with all the definitions, but I think there's a practical reasons why they're important. And part of the reason is I think the way that we define a group or an organization or a threat obviously allows us to work out which tactics we think will be best to use them. And you know, I talk about fascists in the book, and when I talk about fascists or when I talk about Nazis in the book, I mean fascists and Nazis. And there is definitely a kind of spread where those terms are made very, very broad. And, you know, I mean, even back in kind of 1945, George Orwell was saying fascism means nothing anymore because it's used to describe everything from our neighbor we dislike through to the Nazis. You know, does it have any use as a term? And so I do think it's important to kind of keep the terms as accurate as possible, because the tactics that we'll use against different groups vary, of course. The tactics that you are legitimate, or I would argue are legitimate against actual neo-Nazis and actual fascists, are not the same tactics that would be legitimate against UKIP. In some senses, if you're doing them against UKIP, they would both be counterproductive and also kind of unacceptable. And by tactics, I mean a broad array of things. You know, there's lots of talk in the newspapers about things like no platform. This tactic about trying to, you know, remove platforms from fascist speakers, which started in the 70s, but has now become very, very broad in its usage. And actually, kind of, I'm arguing essentially that you can only do things like remove platforms from people, for example, like Holocaust deniers. You know, the Holocaust is not a debate, it happened. And by debating a Holocaust denier, you legitimize it as a debate. And so you should say, we no platform that person. And, you know, I'm sure many of you have heard of groups like the 43 group and the 62 group, the much more militant end of the anti-fascist movement over the post-war period. Again, their tactics were legitimate because the 43 group was a group of Jewish ex-servicemen who came back from the Second World War and saw Oswald Mosley on the streets of London preaching anti-Semitism. And they turned around and said, we're not going to have this, right? And the way they did it was they fought it physically. That's because Oswald Mosley's post-war movement was fascist, right? That becomes an acceptable tactic. Whereas, of course, that's not an acceptable tactic necessarily that you could use with Nigel Farage, and it would also be counterproductive. And so it's about saying different definitions should lead us to say what tactics can be used. And I always remember this famous bit of graffiti that went Hitler, Oswald Mosley, Nick Griffin, Nigel Farage, right? And it was this very simple thing. And actually what it was doing was, it was trying to forge in this kind of historical idea that it's fascist versus anti-fascist. You know, it's about Cable Street in 36, it's about Lewisham in the 70s. And of course, the idea that you would use similar tactics that you used against Hitler, against Nigel Farage is patently absurd, right? And it's completely incorrect. And so what I try to say in the book is it's worth having more accurate definitions, because then when you look at a threat, you turn around and say, I still think that Nigel Farage is racist. I still think that he engages in anti-migrant activism. He's engaged in anti-Muslim activism, and they're unacceptable. But the way we need to beat those is to debate them, to beat them at the ballot box, those sorts of things. What we would do with, say, a Nazi terrorist group that we monitor at Hope Not Hate, for example, is not going to be debating a Nazi terror group that are venerating the Holocaust. We're going to come up with different ways to fight them. So that's really the reason I kind of talk about the different definitions and how and why that's important, really.
So could you tell us, what the heck is the alt-right?
Yeah, so the alt-right, this is something that you probably, you would have seen in newspapers and stuff. And really, I mean, we spent a lot of work trying to define the alt-right, and I spent some time infiltrating the far right, both in Europe and around the UK for a bit. In many ways, the alt-right is a repackaging of the traditional far right. Its core politics are the same as kind of long-standing traditional far right or fascist politics. It's racist, it's anti-Semitic. It's homophobic, it's misogynist. But what the alt-right was essentially is this movement that emerged in America, right, over the last decade or so. And it's this forging of many of the people that were involved in it had been in far-right politics for years before that. So they'd been involved in American neo-Nazi circles or even Ku Klux Klan groups, etc. But what they did was they merged kind of American far-right politics with European far-right ideas. There was a group in 1967 that was merged out of France called the Nouvelle Droite, this philosopher called de Benoit. And basically, his big thing was about saying that the way we win this battle is not by winning at the ballot box, etc. It's about what they call metapolitics, which, without getting too technical, they actually stole from the left and Gramsci. But the idea there is that politics actually happens downstream of culture. If you want to change the world, you need to win the culture, and then you can win the politics. And so you had these American far-right figures that were influenced by these far-right ideas. They kind of meld them together. And then the third element, which sits on top of it, is the way they did politics. It's a really modern far-right movement. We called it, I hope not hate, online antagonistic communities. But that's basically just a way of saying the way they did politics was very hostile. It was online. They engaged in trolling, as it's called. It was very kind of, it was about websites. It was about social media, etc. It was in fact, for the first few years, it was only online. So it's basically these American movements with these European movements coming together and using these certain tactics. They sit within the far right really comfortably. And many people within it, you could argue it could be neo-Nazis or fascists. But for a brief period, it became this movement. And many of you might remember Charlottesville, the anniversary of which was yesterday, which was the big demonstration in America where they actually came onto the streets in North America in 2017 and actually killed an anti-fascist. And they drove a car and killed a woman called Heather Heyer. And the anniversary of that was actually yesterday. And since then, the movement has actually dissipated. It's splintered a lot. But one of the things I guess we'll come on to is in the wake of that event, Donald Trump went on the news and said there was very fine people on both sides of that debate. Yeah. And this is the big thing about the book, is about saying, actually, this isn't just about like little neo-Nazis sat in the corner, sat in a pub somewhere or on a forum somewhere or on Twitter. This is about the mainstreaming of these ideas, the normalization of them, where you can have a demonstration that had Ku Klux Klan flags, swastika flags, and the president of the United States turned around and said they were very fine people. And that was what, I mean, and in some sense, that was almost the end or the high point of the alt-right. It's somewhat dissipated since then, really.
Okay, right. So we should be careful with words, which we should always be anyway. And later on, maybe we'll talk about the policy that I do struggle with even thinking that these people have ideas because they're so repugnant. But we are all right, and I just like to see. Sometimes I just like to see them as a bunch of murderers. Let's think of it like that. But we will have a little look at the themes that connect up across the far right and the ultra right. So you were a failed musician. I'm sorry to hear it. And then you started volunteering in Dagenham to help Hope Not Hate, got into the research department, and you started going undercover. Now, from reading your book, and I haven't read all of it yet, just about halfway through, I think. I don't think you lived for months at a time with the far right. It was kind of more in and out. Is that right?
Yeah, so we kind of do different types of infiltrations at Hope Not Hate, right? So actually one of the chapters in there on the alt-right actually is actually the story of me being the handler for a colleague called Patrick Hermanson, and he went undercover for a full year. And he was kind of, he was left wing and he went in. And so we have some of those ones where we put people in and they stay in for a long time. My thing was very much more like we would identify something that we needed information from, a certain group that we needed to map. And I would go in for short periods. So, I would go to, say, British National Party meetings here and there. I would go to big far-right conferences. I'd go there. Probably the longest one, which I talk about, there's a chapter in the book on it, is I joined a militia group in Alabama. Yeah. And that was a prolonged one. This was in the run-up to the Trump election, we wanted to find out, essentially, what was the Trump vehicle doing to the American far right and how were they interplaying? And so I went out there and posed as a kind of very friendly British person that was really keen on what they were doing. And basically this militia group that was in Alabama, they were heavily armed and they would go to the Mexican border and they would attempt to stop migrants coming across the border, both cartel members smuggling drugs, as they would call them, illegal immigrants coming across. And for them, still inexplicably, they thought Muslim extremists was flooding in from Mexico. And I joined them, and I went to the desert with them, and I kind of lived with them down on the desert for a week or so in the first instance. And each night we would go out and we would sit on the border. And I thought, actually, this was a load of nonsense. We're not going to see everyone. And actually, we saw people every single night. Within about 15 minutes of being there, we saw cartel members up on the hillside looking back through binoculars. And then after the kind of time I spent with them in the desert, I went back and stayed at their houses in Alabama for a period as well, and moved around there. So that was probably the longest kind of prolonged period where I was doing it. But then most of them, as you say, I would join. I'd go for a couple of months. I might be in the place I might be inside for 6 months, but I might only go to one meeting every month, here and there.
So let's talk about the Alabama stuff. Okay. We talked before everybody came on about the lifestyle of people on the far right. Got up early in the morning, washed behind their ears, and so on. You want to talk a little bit about the lifestyle of the far right?
Yeah.
Over here, and also probably in Alabama, because I did find some of it quite surprising.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I spent a lot of time, for example, with the English Defence League, which many of you might remember was kind of the anti-Muslim street movement that emerged in kind of 2009, which was led by this guy called Tommy Robinson, the really violent street-based politics. And of course, he's still around, Tommy Robinson. And I spent a lot of time with them, and I'd go to lots of their demonstrations, probably hundreds over the years in the end. And they weren't just extremely violent, but in terms of their lifestyle, they were extremely heavy drinking. And also there was a huge amount of drugs involved in the English Defence League. So, quite often part of it is because they were drawn, a lot of the activists were drawn out of like the football hooligan scene. So they were kind of street fighters. Tommy Robinson himself, that lots of the rumors for a long time said that he was involved in drug dealing, not just drug taking. And a lot of the people in the movement, you'd go to demonstrations and they were on drugs and they were drinking heavily. Now, from a personal perspective, as an anti-fascist, I actually don't care if people take drugs. It's none of my business. I have no moral issue against it personally. But the issue, of course, is when you've got a group of coked up football hooligans smashing a town centre to pieces and scaring the local Muslim community, right? And obviously then it does become an enormous problem. And looking at some of those demonstrations that I'd go to in places like Leicester and Bolton and Bradford and those sorts of places, sometimes a photographer, sometimes just kind of going along on them, they were extremely violent. There was a huge amount of drinking. It actually became like a battle within the movement to try and reduce the amount of drinking that you would have on it, because they understood that they'd get painted as these kind of yobbish characters. Now, on the flip side of it, you say Alabama lot, they were kind of very different in a sense. I mean, in one sense, they were completely adorable, right? I know I shouldn't say that. It's difficult to say that, but I kind of talk about this in the book about saying they are. One of the reasons we do the undercover work is because it humanizes these people, right? These aren't monsters that land from space and become racists. They are human beings that have terrible politics. And it's very difficult to spend that much time with another human being and not find something about them you like. I mean, some of the people, don't get me wrong, are just utterly repugnant in their extremism, etc. But so, a lot of the Alabama lot were adorable to me. And I I remember kind of on driving back from the desert with them, we stopped at a petrol station. And there was like sweets racks in the petrol station. And this guy called Bama just leans over and says, like, by the way, I've got a list of mosques that when it all kicks off, I know which ones I'm going to wipe out. And I'd spent 4 or 5 days with this guy in the desert, and he'd been nothing but absolutely adorable. But the funny thing about their lifestyle they ate terrible food. But I guess that's not a huge surprise for a group of like lads from Alabama. They ate an awful lot of fried food, and they all smoked heavily constantly. But one of the big things for them was we need to stop drugs flooding across the Mexican border. There are non-white people polluting America with these drugs. And then I'd go to their houses and they'd pull out drugs. And I'd be like, is there not a contradiction here? And they'd say, no, these drugs are from California. And they were like, these were American drugs, so it was fine for them, But so there is like parts of the element, parts of the scene that have always had kind of drug use in them, heavy drinking in them, etc. Part of it is I think a lot of the people involved have quite destructive personalities, and being within the far right for long periods of time. I often say this when I meet young far right people, and I try and I've had a few over the years where I've tried to bring them out. Basically, I'm saying, look around at the movement, look at these people, look how their lives end up. Right, there's very few of them that end up really happy, married with a picket fence going, isn't life great? You know, they end up wearing duffel coats with holes in, sitting in a pub all day long, talking about racism, you know, and they're not, you know, the lifestyle is not conducive. It destroys them as well as everyone else. So, you know, and then the other thing I only would say about lifestyle is there are elements of the far right which are about ultra health. You know, it's about no alcohol, no drugs, vegetarianism, huge amount. And there's a group called Patriotic Alternative we're monitoring at the moment, which is one of the big fascist groups in the UK. And a big thing for them is about people getting fit. It's about, you know, they upload pictures of their bodies once a week where they kind of have been to the gym. So there's different sides to the movement, and there's often a tension between them. What you might call the yobbish kind of beer swilling football hooligan types, and then the kind of pure fascist man, as they would see it.
Pure Aryan. Well, I think if I recollect reading, I think a number of the top Nazis were vegetarian, couldn't stand the sight of blood.
Yeah, I mean, I believe Hitler was a vegetarian, right? I know isn't that a meme, but like, I believe.
Yeah. And I can't remember if it was Goebbels or Goering, or no, it was Himmler, who was taken to an execution and turned away, not execution, shooting some Jews, and couldn't turn, and he turned away because he couldn't stand the sight of blood.
Yeah, yeah.
But why I wanted to pursue this question of the lifestyle is if you're living undercover and you are pretending to be one of them. So a number of questions come to mind. Did you have to drink quite a lot to fit in without getting you banged up in jail? What was your drug taking like, Joe?
I mean, luckily.
No, but look, the Syria, and it'll come on to the Alabama thing, where you were the only guy without a gun and you didn't want to have a gun, and it made you stand out like a sore thumb. So I was wondering how much you had to adopt at times the lifestyle, or whether you had to sit there when they were shouting out racist abuse in their meetings, going, yeah, man, and calling out yourself to fit in, or somehow or another you just played it straight and they were too stupid to see it.
Yeah, so there's a few things. I mean, luckily I like drinking. You know, I enjoy a good drink, and so I'm happy to sit down there. I mean, obviously we have rules in terms of how we do these things. That, you know, there is a fine line, right? In some senses, the difference between, say, ourselves and the police when they do this sort of work is I can take sources to the pub and we can sit there and we can have a drink, and we build a camaraderie and they give that information, right? And obviously the plan is not to get so pissed you say something stupid or do something off, you know. So I mean, there are definitely lines there, and there have been times when I've left events early because, you know, I could feel myself getting drunk, etc. So it is a fine line. And actually I smoke cigarettes, right? And I even used to say to some sources, I probably wouldn't say it nowadays, but like the smoking area of pubs, for example, is a great place to get information. You know, you'd pop out and you'd have a cigarette with these people, and you'd get 5 minutes with someone who's really senior in a far right organization that would normally you'd never give you the time of day, for example. But I'd pop out with them and I could have a conversation with them in the smoking area that I would have never been able to have that time one-on-one and ask questions without that. So I'm not saying smoking is a good thing or drinking is a good thing. The drug thing is not an issue. I mean, it's not like they're kind of handing around drugs and saying, have some. I think most drug takers aren't particularly keen on giving away their drugs, I presume. So it wasn't that was never an issue. In terms of the other question about what it was like in terms of the racism and how you kind of make sure you fit in. Luckily, I mean, the big thing is for us at Hope Not Hate, and I always say this to sources that I've put inside as well, is the key is to listen, right, and not talk. Like the idea is not the more you talk, the more you're going to trip up. But also, when I then sit down with a source at the end of the night and say what was said, I don't need to hear that they've been talking for 2 hours. I need to hear what everyone else was saying, right? And so we kind of encourage people to say as little as possible, and I would say as little as possible. And in terms of kind of confirming their racism, there's very few times where you have to say really horrible things yourselves. Of course, there have been times when you're talking with extreme racists about stuff, and you might use terminology that I would never dream of using in my day-to-day life. And the key actually is it does take a bit of practice, right? I mean, some of the words which I'd never say here, it doesn't work if you say them and you flinch as you say them, right? Because they're not flinching when they're saying them. And I remember actually,
you asked me why I asked you if you were an actor at school.
Yeah. For example, with the lot in Alabama, and I did a project where I infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan for a year. And now that was luckily all remote, and it was on video and it was on emails and stuff. But like, they would use the N-word constantly. You know, a lot of this was about Obama, of course. And of course, you can't go when they say, you know, Obama is the N-word, but you didn't necessarily have to say that yourself, right? And like, there's lots of little ticks and stuff where you'd say, you know, I mean, little things like you wouldn't believe how simple it was, like, you know, political correctness has just gone mad, can be your response to them saying these things. And they kind of go, it's about triggers and ticks that make them think that you're one of them or that you're in agreement with them. I do actually remember the only time, not the only time, but one of the times I first got it wrong was, I don't know if anyone knows Bethnal Green, but by the
Yeah, I've got a note to ask you about that one, about how you nearly got caught out.
Yeah, it was one of my early infiltrations, and it was a meeting of the British National Party and the National Front. It was back in 1993. The BNP won its first councillor, right? And it was in the Isle of Dogs and down in East London. And it was the anniversary, it must have been 3 decades maybe, or 2 decades, can't remember now. But and I said I was going to go along. And I remember I went along with Richard Edmonds, who was the deputy leader of the National Front. And he was this figure that, like, as a researcher of the far right, I'd known, you know, he was like one of the big figures alongside John Tyndall and Martin Webster. He's one of these huge figures of the post-war scene. And we met at Bethnal Green tube station. And for years they were building, I used to live just around the corner years ago. And for years they were building this memorial to the Bethnal Green tube disaster.
Yeah, you'll need to tell people not everybody was around when it happened.
I wasn't suggesting they were.
No, it's just so people know, it was the worst civilian incident during the Second World War. So I guess somebody stumbled on the escalator, and it was like the Hillsborough thing. Everybody went down, and I think it was 172 people died in it or something.
Yeah, and it was during an air raid, and I think someone made the stories, but it was possibly a woman with a child tripped on the bottom step, and then a huge crush happened. And they were building this memorial outside the station too, and it was going on for years. I believe it's complete now.
It is.
And I was kind of stood outside the train station because we would always, the way it was work is you would meet at a redirection point. They don't just give out the venue. You meet at a place, they'll pick you up at the place, and then they'll move you to where the venue is. Because of course, part of my job was finding out where the venues were and getting them shut down, which was why we would do part of this work, is we'd call the venues, we'd get people there and try and get the event shut down. So they would always try and leave it as late as possible before they told anyone. I remember being there and there's kind of like an awkward silence, and I just pointed at the memorial and said, oh, isn't it great that they've finally built a memorial for the victims of this? And I'd kind of just, I guess the way I describe it is I'd misjudged how Nazi they were. And this guy kind of like jumps into apoplectic and goes, don't be ridiculous, absolutely, kind of essentially saying, these people got what they deserved. If you really want to see a tragedy, you need to look at Dresden and what the British did in Germany. And you need to see what the British did after the Second World War in terms of post-war population transfers. And, that's the real disaster here. And I kind of realized that I'd gone, I've really not pitched my level of Nazism correctly. I kind of laugh about it now. It obviously was pretty terrifying at the time. But so there are those kind of moments there. And, there's been a few times where I was at some events in Stockholm where I could feel that I wasn't saying or doing enough and possibly got kind of rumbled a little bit there. And so there was a few kind of hairy moments, but most of the time it's just about being affable, chatty, and nodding with agreement and kind of chirping in with the odd thing rather than turning up with a big racist tirade, because in some ways that would give you away probably much quicker.
Okay, so having said all of that, there's barely a chapter goes by where you don't describe having to run away from somebody or another. So it wasn't quite as simple and as cool and calm and collected as that. You've had thugs chase you.
Yeah,
through hospitals.
Yeah, so part of it, as well as doing the infiltration work, I would do, part of the thing was finding out where events were, and then we would want to photograph them, right? Part of what Hope Not Hate does, and we still do it, we try to photograph as many far-right events and demonstrations as we can. So that allows us to see who's there, how many people there are, all those sorts of things. And that sometimes I'd get caught, is the short answer. And I mean, the one you mentioned there in the hospital it was a group called the London Forum, which was this kind of really very, very extreme think tank. Lots of kind of, there'd be people there in like weird SS uniforms and stuff, and they meet in London, and we actually destroyed them. And I talk about it in the book. My colleague Patrick went undercover in there and we destroyed them, and it was a real big win for Hope Not Hate. But we kind of found the venue. Then me and a friend sat opposite under a kind of a van, and we lay on the floor photographing them. And then we called the venue, and we got all of our supporters at Hope Not Hate to call the venue and say, you've got these neo-Nazis upstairs, you should cancel. So they then cancelled the event. And we stood outside, and as they trickled out, we photographed them all, and we thought, this is going well. And then invariably, someone kind of spotted us lying on the floor under the van. And the guy I was with was much older than me, and he was in his late 40s and or maybe kind of early 50s. And I've never seen someone move that fast. And he was like, we need to go. He dragged me out from under the bus, and we run. And about this group of about maybe 15 skinheads come running across the road. And the only place we could, and I'm actually, I mean, it's quite shameful, really, in the sense that we had to run into a hospital. It was probably scared that have been daylights out of the doctors and the nurses and the security guards there. And we ran into the hospital, and we kind of went through the maze, and we managed to hide. And then eventually the police came piling in to arrest us. And we had to sit them down and say, and we had these sheets with the pictures of all the people we were looking for. And lots of them were like guys with guns with swastikas behind them. We were like, this guy was chasing us. At which point the police became much more amenable, and they took us to safety, which is very kind of them. But yeah, I mean, there was a few times. I mean, one of the I don't mention in the book is I once ran into a meeting and took pictures. And in the book, I say someone grabbed me and threw me down the stairs, and they did. What I don't say in the book is the guy must have been about 85. I left that detail out of the book.
Yeah, I can't think why. Just sort of drift back to Alabama again for a minute, because you're talking about the police being sympathetic and understanding your position when you're in the hospital, but sometimes police forces are pretty sympathetic to some of this far right stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably one of the more shocking than the kind of the racism, etc., I saw in America, which in some senses, sadly, you do get desensitized to, was in Alabama. We're talking like an extreme right or far right militia with heavily armed with kind of semi-automatic rifles, shotgun. I mean, we're talking like they look like Rambo, but slightly fatter. And we're out in the desert there, sort of thing. And I see the kind of border patrol come over, and I thought, oh God, we're in trouble now. And the border patrol, their job is obviously to monitor the border and make sure that people don't come across it. And they pulled out, and they were just like incredibly friendly, shaking hands. And they even kind of pulled out maps and said, if you monitor this bit, we'll monitor that bit. You know, and I was like, hang on a second, we've got a state agency in America working with a far right, heavily armed far right militia group. It was terrifying, you know. And of course, there's been lots of examples. I mean, in the UK, actually, I mean, in terms of far right and policing, there's been some really worrying stories over recent years. I mean, I'm sure, you know, in Germany, there's been some really horrifying stories of kind of infiltration within the police. In America, there's been lots of stories that have become really, really kind of shown how big a problem it is. And sadly, there have been examples in the UK. I mean, there was a case just a few months ago where a police officer was found to be a member of the banned neo-Nazi terror group National Action. And there's been that was a kind of big wake-up call. And he was in the band, he was in a terrorist group, a National Action, before he became a police officer, and he managed to slip through the net. So there have been examples here, and there's some kind of very extreme groups, both in America and Canada, etc., that we've found people in. And then the other one is the army. You know, I hope not. I've done some projects where we had a guy who went undercover for us in a group called Generation Identity, which is a European identitarian group, which I talk a lot about in the book, and very extreme. And we found these two guys in it, and they were kind of bragging to my source, saying, we're in the Navy, I'm just about to get a job at Fast Lane on a nuclear submarine. At which point we had to kind of say, I don't think so. And so, but we have found a number of people in the armed forces. What I would say is, generally speaking, actually, when we've approached the armed forces about them, they've been very supportive and very open to talking about it. And of course, they don't want far right people in the army. The last thing they want is far right individuals being handed guns and sent to the Middle East, right? That's not what they're looking for either. So I would say the action hasn't been as fast or swift as we would like, but generally speaking, there has been a sympathetic ear there.
Okay, let's turn it around the other way. One of the things that Hope Not Hate does, and has had some significant successes with and saved some murders, is by turning somebody from the far right into an informant or a this or a that. I mean, all kinds of words to describe people turning. You know, the jump from being a race hater to turning on all your mates that you've grown up with is a massive individual psychological jump. Can you talk us through that one a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say from the outset actually that my colleagues Matthew Collins and Nick Lowles do much more of this than I do, and they're much better at it than I am. And in part, Matthew Collins, he's actually got his own book called Hate, where he was a member of the British National Party for many years and was on the cusps of a terror group called C18. And he actually turned and he became a source for Searchlight with Jerry Gable. And he now runs up our intelligence project. And so he's very good because he knows how to speak to these people and kind of engage with them. But the wider question about why people do it and how we do it. I mean, I obviously can't go into specifics about the ins and outs about how we do it for obvious reasons, but not least that it was being recorded. But there are a few motivations, right? And some people change sides, and they do have genuine kind of reformations. You know, like Matthew Collins, who I mentioned, talks in his book about Welling Library, the Welling bookshop, the BNP bookshop back in the day. And Welling Library, there was a huge attack by the far right. And they attacked people, and a woman got hit with a hammer, and it was awful. And he realized essentially the horror of the politics that he was engaging with and decided he needed to do something about it. And so you do get some people that essentially see these moments where they see the reality of what they're engaging in. You know, another one, famous one, the old Searchlight one, was Ray Hill.
Yeah.
Again, another really famous anti-fascist that same thing, you know, he was in South Africa and he was kind of seeing under apartheid, was seeing the reality of his politics, and with time decided that he had to make a difference. Now, some people just want to walk away, and some people turn around and say, actually, they want to make amends for what they've done. And I would argue, of course, as an anti-fascist, they should make amends. You know, the politics they've engaged in ruins people's lives, and I think they should try and do as much as they can to fix what they've done. So you do get those people that kind of say, I want to make a difference and I want to change. There's also other reasons, right? And they're much less, you know, some people turn around and say, you know, there's a power struggle in a far right group and they want to do over the person that's in front of them, right? And they know that we're a better place. You know, I've had people come to me who basically say, I hate this person, and I'll give you all the information I have on them. And they don't turn around and they haven't become a great person. You have to remember that. But from our perspective, it's about, we try to hoover in as much information as we possible, prove how much of it is true. And then that allows us to use it in various different ways. And so some people, it's not just necessarily that they've changed their ways. And other people we approach, you know, and sometimes someone is kind of spiraling and you can see that they're getting involved in more and more dangerous politics. And we think there might be a chance to intervene here and speak to them and say, look, what's happening here? You know, and there have been examples. There was one a few years ago where my colleagues kind of contacted this guy who'd been getting more and more extreme. He'd been in the far right for decades and decades. And it transpired he was gay and he was Jewish. And every time he thought he was going to be found, he felt like he had to become more extreme. And kind of my colleagues picked up on that and engaged with him and brought him out. And since, I believe I've never met the guy, but my understanding is, you know, he's been to a synagogue, he's been to a gay bar and all those sorts of things. So we do approach people where we think actually something's going on here. And I've done that myself, where I've kind of just basically messaged someone and said, I think we should talk, you know, and luckily being at Hope Not Hate, many of these groups think we are the bogeyman, you know, that they hate us because of what we do. And some people will speak to us or speak to me just out of pure curiosity, you know, and if you can spend enough time with these people, you know, especially I've only really done it with much younger people and kind of said, look, I sit down with them and say, look, this is where your politics this is what's going to happen to your life, right? You're not going to come away with you're not going to go to university and have a great job and all these things that you want to do. Like, this is going to destroy you. And if you carry on doing it for decades and you carry on doing it for years and you keep doing harm, I'm going to do everything I can to make your life as bad as possible, right? I'm going to publish your picture. Right? I'm going to make it up. Don't go down that route, right? I think there's a better route for you and that you should walk away now. And so I'll contact people, you know, Generation Identity is a good one. I spoke to so many of them in the end, you know, groups and groups of them where I would go for drinks with them. And many of them have I'm really proud of it, have walked away and have never been involved in far right politics again. They didn't want to give information, which is fine, but they kind of realized that this wasn't for them. And also no one had challenged their ideas, right? That's another thing. We go to the pub with these guys. They spend their time down the pub with people in the far right and they say something horribly racist and everyone nods because that's the world they've found themselves in. So if you know, sometimes it's just useful to sit down with them and say, I think the Holocaust did happen and here's why I think it happened and here's all the evidence. And if you speak to them enough times about it, you might win the odd person around. Not everyone, but.
Well, one of the people I was really surprised kept meeting you, despite the fact that he knew you were kind of after him, was Chowdhury.
Yeah.
That was like just to remind people, he was was he the Hook guy, Dr. Hook guy?
No, that was Abu Hamza. Anjem
Oh.
Chowdhury was the guy. He ran Al Mujahirun. You would have seen him on TV. This guy was on the news for years and years, and like, he ran this Islamist group called Al Mujahirun. And Nick and I at Hope Not Hate would basically like, like our colleagues at CST. Many of you might come across Community Support Trust. Obviously they'd been looking at Anjem Chowdhury for decades, of course, and we started going along to some demonstrations, right? And this is just before the rise of the Islamic State, and Nick and I went down, and we went down like many people thought, actually, this has got nothing to do with anti-fascism, right? The guy's an Islamist. But from our perspective, the guy was anti-Semitic, he was homophobic, he was a misogynist, and as far as we was concerned, it didn't matter whether or not he was an Islamist or a Nazi, we didn't like him. And so we started going down to his demonstrations. And this was very different, as you say, like the infiltration stuff. We just turned up with a camera. And at the time, they'd have these demonstrations every single Friday, and we'd go down for about a year every Friday. And they were just interested in who on earth these two random white fellas were with a camera that was stood there taking pictures of them, and they would chat to us, And it was this weird thing where they would be singing like, screaming "Death to the West," "Kill Jews, kill women," and then they would come over and say, "Oh, how are you?" And I got to know Anjem Chowdhury a little bit. And basically, like at the time, he was a bit of a clown, or people, like a lot of the people in the media thought he was a clown, because he was this guy that was so extreme, he was ridiculous. And from our perspective, a lot of the far right, it's all they talked about. The English Defence League came out of opposition to it. And so there was also that element saying, if we want to fight the far right, we need to fight the stuff that's driving it. And so we wanted to find out who everyone was, and we chat to them. And as I say, he knew exactly who we were and who I was. And he would text me all the time. He would invite me to Islam, and I'd say, "Thank you very much, but I'm fine." And we would go sit in a coffee shop, etc. And then it started to get very strange, of course, with the rise of the Islamic State. Sorry, I live on a main road. You probably hear that.
It's not that they're after you.
Yeah. And we started to notice that people were disappearing out of our pictures. We'd go the next week and there'd be another person not there. And then there'd be another person not there. And of course, they were all going to Syria and Iraq to fight with the Islamic State. And then this has become, obviously, this gets to the stage where, and also lest we forget that like Al Mujahirun were the individuals they were involved in the 7/7 bombing. They were involved in the Lee Rigby murder, the Westminster bombing, the Westminster attack. I mean, you name them. And there are also lots of attacks in Israel. This was a global network. The Harry's Place bombing was Al Mujahirun related.
Mike's Place.
Pardon? Mike's Place. Sorry. And then we just found out we had this massive archive of photographs where it was showing these people disappearing. And so we finally decided, we kind of published on it, and we did a big report called Gateway to Terror, which basically outlined all of the terror attacks around the world that have been linked to this network, and all of the people that were heading out to Syria. And then I talk about it in the book. I'd go out to Iraq, and I went out to northern Iraq and spent some time on the front line. Basically, like essentially the main idea was actually to try and get enough information to come back and talk to the British left, actually. And at the time, a lot of the British far left were, some of you might remember these kind of ludicrous things like, Left Unity event, where someone was talking about the progressive potential and anti-imperialist potential of the Islamic State. And we were sitting there and going, these guys are mass murderers. And so the idea was to talk to refugees and migrants, go to the front line each night and meet them as they came across, and kind of tell their stories a little bit. And so that was the kind of arc of Anjem Chowdhury. Now, he's actually, fun enough, you mentioned him, he's been in prison. He went to prison for supporting the Islamic State for 5 years. He was then under loads of restrictions. About 2 weeks ago, he's actually been released from his restrictions. He's allowed to speak publicly again. He's actually tried to get onto a few social media platforms and been kicked off. But as is often the case in these situations, that many of his supporters are now dead in graves in Syria and Iraq, and he's not, because he convinced them to go. But let's not be clear that he never went himself.
Yeah, you called him a coward to his face.
Yeah, I mean, probably not the wisest move I ever made, that actually. But I put a camera in his face, and essentially, I just said to him, like, look, I think you're a coward. You're sending all these 19-year-old kids to go and fight and die, and you're sat here in East London owning a sweet shop.
Did you ever make a list, Joe, of all the things that you think, in retrospect, that wasn't so wise to say?
No, my mum has, though, since reading the book.
Right. In the last few minutes, let's pick up a bit on, and it is, if we aren't a bit frightened listening to you talking, when you start reading this book and describing some of the conventions across Europe, it looks like this lot are on the verge of power. It's very frightening. So perhaps talk about the international nature of these groups and some sense of how many people are involved across these very diverse, as you say, in some ways quite diverse groups, from the clean living Aryans to the beer swilling Alabamans and people from Barnsley, for all I know.
Well, let me add a third group, right? So you've got I mean, basically, so far, we've only really talked about the traditional far right again, right? But one of the big things, kind of the main point of the book in one sense, I kind of open it saying that well over 1 billion people at the time I wrote it last year lived under far right governments or radical right governments to various extents, whether or not that was Trump's America. There's a chapter on Bolsonaro in Brazil. There's a chapter on Modi in India. And of course, then we kind of mention Europe. If you look at Europe, I mean, it's funny enough, like 20 years ago, or 10 years ago when I started, the idea that this many far-right elected people would exist in Europe would have been kind of an anathema to us. You know, if you remember, like I started in Dagenham, at the time the BNP had 2 MEPs and about 64 councillors and 1 member of the London Assembly, right? If you look at Europe now, you know, we have the Front National or National Rally in France with Le Pen. Again, polling either, you know, in some polls, polling first in the upcoming presidential elections at the beginning of next year. You know, we could be months away from the president of a leading European nation coming from the far right. Now, she's not as extreme as her father was. He was an anti-Semitic Holocaust denier, but she is far right, right? She's anti-immigrant, she's anti-migrant, her politics are Islamophobic, and we could be months away from that, right? We look at Sweden, right? If we just look at countries in Europe where the far right are either in coalition governments or in local governments or regional governments, or they have MPs. We have the Sweden Democrats in Sweden. We have the True Finns in Finland. We have, there's in Denmark, we have Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, which we've got elections coming up next month, which they're looking like they're doing okay. But again, around 20% of the vote. Germany was the exception, right? Germany was supposed to be the exception where the far right wouldn't rise again because of historical reasons. The AfD are in parliamentary chambers across Germany now. You know, they, you know, and some of the recent elections haven't been as good as they'd hoped, but they're still way better than we should have ever presumed they would be. Law and Justice in Poland, right, are currently passing a whole swathe of anti-LGBT legislation and anti-migrant legislation. I actually opened the book in Poland at a far-right demonstration where there was hundreds of thousands of people. Hungary with Orban, again, has been engaged in kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about George Soros, and he's talked about anti-Muslim politics and anti-LGBT politics. He's he's been in Hungary for years now. Liga was in coalition in Italy with Bolsonaro. Liga in Italy, again, part of the national government. We've got Vox rising in Spain. Each example here is a European country that was supposed to be an exception, right? Germany was supposed to be an exception because of the historical record. It's not. Sweden was an exception because Sweden was so democratic and liberal. It's not, in terms of the Sweden Democrat. Portugal, only came to democracy so late after Salazar fell. All of a sudden, there's a far-right party making waves in Portugal as well. Each of these kind of things that we felt were kind of the exception to the rule has been falling. You throw into that, things that I wouldn't necessarily call far-right, but, Erdogan in Turkey, and there is a direction of travel I talk about in the book, which is, I think many of us felt that there was this kind of march of history towards more progressive, liberal, open politics. And in the last 2 decades, or probably since the end of the Cold War in 1990, we've seen the resurgence, the re-emergence of anti-democratic, anti-liberal democratic anyway, kind of anti-progressive politics. And now, as to say, you throw India into that, the biggest democracy in the world, Brazil, an enormous emerging country, and America under Trump. These are not the same people I'm talking about in terms of gun-toting Nazis. I'm not saying they're the same thing, but they are political parties that are engaging in regressive politics, that are attacking minority communities and vulnerable people. And the direction of travel is, in some ways, very uneven. I wouldn't want to say it's like a direct line. It's an uneven line, but it is a line that is heading in a direction from the early 1990s to today, which is a line, which is why that gets drums in the distance. As you say, they're getting ever louder.
You began to talk about some of the when you talked about in the opening chapter about the gathering in Poland, I guess one of the things that kind of stands out, perhaps compared to the 30s, is that this stuff isn't necessarily simply nationalistic. It is transnational. There is themes that run across this that allow them to welcome people from other countries in, that perhaps was somewhat different in the 1930s, although heaven knows Mosley was very welcome in Hitler's circles and would have been vice versa. Can you just highlight for a minute the kind of the headlines of the things that these people hate?
Yeah, I mean, you make a really, really good point, right? And I mean, in one sense, the far right and fascist movements have always had like an internationalist element, right? So you mentioned like, obviously, I mean, that looks like different things. The Nazis were international in one sense, in the sense that they wanted to conquer everything. But you do get, and Oswald Mosley, for example, after the Second World War, his big thing was Europe a nation. He wanted to have a united Europe. And throughout the war, you also get racial nationalists who, again, have always conceived the nation in terms of their race. So it's not necessarily about geographic borders. It's about blood. It's about whiteness. So you've always had those movements. The big one in the UK was Colin Jordan, who was the big post-war neo-Nazi, or the Nazi of the British post-war period. So there's always been these things, but there has, as you said, there's always been this tension. I always remember, again, my colleague Matthew Collins saying that, like, when he was in the BNP, they would have these big events, usually around like Remembrance Sunday. And they still, to this day, the National Front march on Remembrance Sunday after the main event, they go down to the Cenotaph. And he would say they'd come from, they'd bring over the Germans and the Poles, etc. And everything's going great and everyone's getting on. They've all got this racial kinship and everyone's drinking and shaking hands, and a few more drinks go down. And, the English lot start singing 12 German bombers in the air, and start, singing about the Second World War. And all of a sudden the Germans get angry and then they're all fighting. And actually, I remember even just a few years ago, I was at the Cenotaph for the National Front event, and they brought some Poles, and the Poles pulled big flares, were waving these flares around, and there was a fight in front of the Cenotaph, right? And I'm not sure how respectful that is, but what it was is these are nationalist movements that were collaborating, right? They were British nationalists collaborating with German nationalists and seeing common cause. A lot of the ones I mentioned in the book, so a lot of these newer movements, especially in the age of the internet, they conceptualize the threat internationally. And by that, I mean, they think of themselves as either European or Western, and the threat is both internal and external. And in most cases, it's seen as Islam and Muslims invading Europe from the outside, or Muslim communities inside Europe kind of conquering from within. And so you do get these movements like the alt-right, again, which think in terms of transnationalism, or especially the anti-Muslim movements. Again, they often think of themselves in terms of like a fortress Europe. They often talk about the gates of Vienna, the famous invasion by the Muslims into Austria. So a lot of these movements do, and a part of that is the internet, right? The internet has fundamentally changed the way you can do activism in many amazing ways that the progressive movements can use as well. But I always remember Le Pen, after her last presidential election, run to be a president, she made a video thanking the online militants all over the world for their help. And there was this comment underneath by this Australian guy saying, I spent the entire election making content for you and putting it on social media. The internet has allowed people to work outside of the constructs of traditional far-right organizations and have thousands of people collaborating all over the world together, but outside of structures. It's like almost like a school of fish. It's like a many-headed hydra. There's not a single leader. There's figureheads that emerge. And these movements are genuinely global. Most of the neo-Nazi terror groups that we monitor in the UK, it takes us months or sometimes years to even work out if they're in the UK. We'll monitor terror groups on their kind of closed channels on things like apps like Telegram. We did an exposé, my colleague Patrick did the other day, about a new group called the National Partisan Movement. A bunch of them were in America, a bunch of them were in Sweden, some were in the UK, they were all over the world, South Africa, Australia. And these movements are collecting people in from all over the world. And the internet has just made that possible in a way that it was much harder previously.
Well, amongst the themes that seem very common to most of them, whiteness, anti-Islam, anti-Semitic, homophobic, misogynistic. And then there's the latest one, when I was speaking to your colleague Gemma, would never have occurred to me, spent 10 years on it, wouldn't have occurred to me, is a deep opposition to theories of climate change, which, and perhaps you could explain to colleague why climate change skepticism lines up with the far right.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think it's scarier than that, actually. Traditionally, the far right has denied climate change. What I would say, when in power, they've, or anywhere in Europe, for example, or, Trump, Bolsonaro are great examples of this. Bolsonaro reopening, logging in the Amazon, Trump's pro-coal agenda, etc. They try to stop change that is kind of being put in place, international change that's needed to deal with climate change. So there has always been this long strain which has denied climate change. And part of that is they believe that it's another tool in the conspiracy to control people, to control white people. There is this global, these traditional ideas about Jewish world control and the New World Order. There is always some sort of global movement, supposedly in their eyes, attempting to control the world and using different mechanisms to control populations. And for them, this supposed threat of climate change, for many of them, this was seen as just another example of being used to control populations. There was no proof for it. And also, you got to remember, in some ways, I think of the conspiracy scene as like a bookshelf, right? And on one end, you have like the relatively innocuous conspiracy theories about moon landings and JFK or whatever. And the last book on the shelf is Holocaust denial, right? And somewhere along towards that is things like climate denial. Once you start to believe that any official story should be doubted and that can't be trusted, I'm not saying there aren't conspiracies, because there are, but once you start to believe that any official story or any official record or experts more in general can't be trusted, if you can get to the stage where some people don't even believe the Holocaust happened, right, the most documented event in human history, a lot of these people within the far right are seeing, especially liberal, progressive, democratic states saying we need to do more. For them, the obvious thing is just an oppositional position, which says, okay, I disagree with them. What I would say is one of the changes we've been tracking at Hope Not Hate in the last couple of years is, I think, actually scarier. In Europe, there is a consensus now which says climate change is real and it's urgent and we need to do something about it. All the polling shows the majority of people agree with that. And as a result, it's not politically expedient anymore to turn around and say, we don't believe in it. In fact, it ostracizes you because lots of people think you sound a bit crazy. There was a time when it didn't ostracize you because people thought that the only people that really cared about climate change wore sandals and demanded you stopped eating meat. And so it was quite a popular thing to oppose them. That's not the case anymore, right? We've seen where climate change is already leading. And what we're starting to see is, in some cases, a shift towards co-option of the climate issue. And instead of saying we need to deal with the climate crisis in a progressive, open manner, they're pushing for it in a different way, right? They're doing a couple of things. One is saying, shut the borders. Especially in Europe, we're seeing groups on the far right understanding the climate crisis is going to possibly mean millions of people are forced to move. As the droughts continue in Africa, etc., many of these people will move north, right? Where there's resources, where there's infrastructure, etc. And they see this happening and they're saying, okay, well, we need to fight climate change, but we also need to do a couple of things. We need to close our borders, stop anyone in. We need to kind of pull up the drawbridge and protect our own resources. And we also need to kind of make sure that we protect our own, we shouldn't be giving away water and even vaccines, whatever it is. So that kind of nationalism is justified through climate change for them. And the other thing they do is they expand what they mean by environment, right? So it's not just about ecology. It's not just about CO2 in the air. They say we need to protect our environment. And by that, their environment, they mean their culture as well. And I don't mean there's nothing wrong with protecting one's culture, but what they mean is saying we not only need to kind of protect our rivers and our land and our soil, we need to protect our blood, we need to protect our inherent culture, etc. And there's always been that strain within ecofascism. Blood and soil goes back to the Third Reich, right? Yeah. It's not a kind of new thing. So one of the things I'm more worried about is if the far right want to deny the climate change in Europe, at least, it's going to be a vote loser. Unfortunately, if they do it in Brazil, it means the Amazon's going to disappear. But what it does mean is in future, I'm more worried about them co-opting the climate movement and doing it for negative or regressive politics and saying, actually, the way we do this is by shutting down, hoarding resources and throwing into it these other things like blood and soil.
Okay, so in the last 2, 3 minutes, I guess if one looks at fighting racism, which for your language is a little bit more hard than, say, the CST. CST's role, protect the community, research threats.
Mm-hmm.
Your goal at Hope Not Hate, research threats, disrupt, so that's a very active politics, disrupt the right to cause chaos, which fortunately quite often turns out to be relatively easy.
Mm-hmm.
And but let's end up on a positive note, a very positive note, because you work for an organization called Hope Not Hate. So let's talk about the hope bit of Hope Not Hate before everybody goes to sleep having nightmares and very, very anxious. Talk to us about hope.
Sure. Seems to be a lot of ambulances going past now. I hope that does not happen. What I would say, I mean, I think CST are brilliant, and as you say, obviously their primary aim is defending the Jewish community, and that. But we have worked with them. You know, we did a report on the conspiracy scene where CST and us there was a source undercover that was in the conspiracy scene looking at left and right groups coming together. And Dave Rich there wrote an article the other day for the Jewish Chronicle talking about CST's role in, for example, finding the Copeland killer as well. So yeah, CST also do really active work as well. The hopeful bit, actually, this is the bit I always kind of joke and say that I work on the hate bit at Hope Not Hate, and rather than the hope bit. But the truth of the matter is, I think I am actually really hopeful. And I know that probably hasn't come across, right? Because I do think the challenges are enormous, as I say, and there is a real danger we're going to lose, right? But the really hopeful bit is that we'll only lose if we don't fight, right? And this is what Hope Not Hate's all about. We still remain the majority, right? People that dislike fascists are the majority almost everywhere, right? And so if we decide that we want to fight this and we want to come together and work together, and the pillars of liberal democracy might be shaking in various parts of the world, but we have the tools and we have the people and we have the energy and all those things and the enthusiasm to win the battle, as long as we choose to fight it, right? And this is what Hope Not Hate does, is, there is examples. Like if you look at the British National Party, when I joined in 2010, it was a terrifying threat. It was the biggest electoral far-right threat in British history. But Hope Not Hate, along with thousands of other anti-fascists from other organizations, as well as progressive movements and non-political people, came together and knocked on hundreds of thousands of doors and delivered millions of pieces of literature and tried to offer a kind of hopeful vision that wasn't about discrimination and prejudice. It was about a future. And it won, right? And the BNP today, going from the largest far-right political force in British politics, has dozens of members now. It is nothing now. It's on its knees. These victories win, right? And actually, when we do fight these things, we do win them, right? So I don't think the issue is, I never want people to come away from things thinking like it's really despondent and we just have to sit here and lose, because the truth is every time we properly fight, we win. And so as long as we keep properly fighting, we'll keep winning. And I think that's the thing that's really hopeful here. And hopefully that's the idea of what Hope Not Hate does, right? Which is about, as well as the research side, it has an education unit which spends time in schools. It has a kind of campaign team, which is about fighting in elections, but community organizing, going into vulnerable communities and working with them. There are so many amazing stories out there that are exciting and hopeful. And yeah, that's the hopeful message, right? As long as we fight, we're going to win.
Yeah, just, is there a way you could modify the word fight? Or, because it sounds very aggressive, there are things that, because not every 85-year-old man's going to throw you down a stair, and there's quite a few 85-year-olds on the thing. We can fight it by.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And actually, like, one of the reasons Hope Not Hate is called Hope Not Hate is because a lot of the research when it was being set up was saying actually a lot of the traditional language of the anti-fascist movement was exactly as you say. It was about fighting and all that sort of thing. And I sometimes do get carried away on that. What I mean by fighting, I mean it in its really most broad sense, right? I mean, it's about opposition. And it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm saying everyone, as long as everyone goes undercover in a militia in Alabama, will be okay. It's not what I'm saying, I mean, actually, if you look at the vast majority of anti-fascist activism in British history, it's not militant. It's not about fighting on the streets. It's about people talking to people in their workplace. It's about people delivering leaflets in their communities. It's about people knocking on doors and having conversations with their neighbors, right? That's the vast majority of anti-fascist activism ever in Britain has been along those lines. We tell the stories of the 43 group and the 62 group because they're these amazing, brave moments in our kind of movement's history. But the vast majority of people is like women and children and men going out and speaking to their neighbor. And we talk about things now, like we do a thing called difficult conversation training at Hope Not Hate, right? Which is about giving people the tools to go into their workplace when someone says something racist or homophobic and challenging them in a progressive way, right? And having a conversation with them. You know, and the same happens now when we're talking about this conspiracy scene. We've all got a neighbor, a brother and sister, or a cousin or an auntie that said something that we've thought, hang on a second. What I mean by fight is about just not letting these things slide, not turning around and saying there's so much of this stuff on social media. You know, it could be reporting a message on social media that's got discrimination on it. It could be pulling a colleague aside or a friend aside, you know, when you're playing golf with them or whatever it is you do for a hobby, and just saying, I disagree with you. And that's what I mean by fight. I don't mean that we all need to go out onto the streets and build barricades.
No, I understand. I mean, I know when everyone on security duty at the synagogue, I make a point of saying good morning to everybody who walks past and asking them how they are and wishing them well. And I know that some of the people engage in conversation quite regularly now as they see me around and about. And it is about building community cohesion with the small things in life. The small things can make big differences, I guess.
Absolutely.
So I've got written down here 3 words: living with terror, and I've got it written next. I've got double entendre. Your wife is living with terror. I presume there are times when you're pretty damn frightened, particularly if the bounty hunter from Alabama is still looking for you. So I do think it's remarkable work that you and your colleagues are doing. I'm not here to push the agenda of your organization in particular. Thank you for guiding us on some of the contemporary challenges that are going on. For those, I don't know, somebody asked how extensive all this stuff is. It is worth reading Joe's book. There are 2 ways to do it. One is to borrow the copy off me, but the other, which is Joe's preference, is for you to go and order it online so it sells more copies. So that's what you got to do. I'm not lending it to any of you. It's not the funnest read, but it reminds one that one has to mobilize one's own inner resources to make their community a better place. Joe, thank you very much for giving up your evening for us. It has been fascinating. It's not been a laugh, but it has been fascinating. And I do think it's very important. And I saw that you're getting a round of virtual applause from members of the community.
No, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate you organising it. And thanks everyone for coming. I know an hour and a half listening to me talk about such depressing stuff can be a bit horrible, but thank you. I really appreciate you coming. Thank you.
No, it's important stuff. Thank you, Joe. Have a good evening, everybody. And to those
thank you very much.
Shabbat shalom, everyone. Thanks a lot, Joe.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, good night. Thank you, David, for organising.
Thank you, David.
Bye.